What's up, J-Fusion fans, and welcome back to another video. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this video is not intended for viewers under the age of 13. So, if you noticed from our videos, if you noticed our homepage for a very long time, we mostly talk about tokusatsu and tokusatsu shows in general. So, I've been thinking, what if you were given a chance to live in a tokusatsu world of your choice? Which is it gonna be? Now, before we get into that, I would like to give a twist to this. Now, considering that tokusatsu logic is, well, pretty flawed, why don't we add some reality into it? So, would you live in that particular tokusatsu world given that, let's say for example, it works in a way that this world, that this reality of ours does? Now, if you don't understand what that means, I will explain later on through the various series that I will uh, introduce, and these various tokusatsu worlds that exist that are going to be in the choices. So I will explain that later. Anyway, for this video, I will go through the Super Sentai franchise, the Kamen Rider franchise, basically every tokusatsu franchise that I at least know. So maybe I know there are a lot of tokusatsu shows out there that are practically just one-offs, so I probably wouldn't go into those. So we're going to go by franchises because they kind of have established universes in a way. So, by the way, I will also put in probably the same category the different franchises that have a lot of similarities, starting with these few worlds that we're going to introduce or we're going to take a look at right off the bat. So, if you're choosing either the Super Sentai, the Ultraman, or probably even the a Kaiju series, now these three universes have something in common, and that would be giant monsters. So for most of the Super Sentai franchise, the heroes fight against monsters that are capable of growing in size to uh, tens of meters tall, or they are fighting against enemies that have their own robots as well, or any giant monster that can be created and released at the very beginning. So basically, Super Sentai heroes do have to fight them using their giant robots. And for Ultraman, of course, you become the giant and you have to fight the giant monsters. Now, if you are going to choose the Kaiju universe, by the way, it's more likely that you are going to be that giant monster. So if you choose to live in a Kaiju universe, uh, you probably would want to be the monster. Kind of like Godzilla, of course. It's up to you if you want to be the hero or not, but nonetheless, you are the Kaiju. So, if that's your choice, then, uh, well, good on you, I guess. So, before you choose any of those worlds, I kind of would like to talk about the possible consequences. Uh, because, if we talk about the pros, you either get a very cool robot, you become a superhero. Again, those are the cool parts about it, but what about the consequences? Again, I mentioned earlier that we're going to add some reality into this. So, what kind of real world mechanics would we apply to these worlds? So, like I said earlier as well, these three franchises share giant monsters as their theme. Of course, for Super Sentai, that's not always the case, but for the most part, they do fight giant monsters in the later part of the episode. So, if you're to fight giant monsters, one thing comes to mind: the collateral damage. So, whether you are the hero or whether if you're a kaiju and you actually choose to be the villain, well, again, that's up to you. So, you're gonna have to consider those things. Now, if again for the kaiju, probably could get away with it because you are the monster, you are exempt from responsibility, and well, if you choose to be on the side that supports the monster, like a human ally, well, good luck with that because you're gonna have to be responsible for the damage that's going to be caused. That's basically what I'm saying here. And you probably can only imagine how much you would have to spend for even just a part of the city that's destroyed, or maybe half the city destroyed if you're fighting a huge scale battle. But nonetheless, you're gonna have to spend probably billions or trillions every single week, especially if we consider doing this on a weekly basis or on a regular basis. And not to mention the construction of buildings, infrastructure, and all those things. It's gonna take time. It's not gonna be like, oh, everything is poof, back to normal. Probably for Ultraman, you could get away with this if, and only if, you have special powers that can fix those issues. But for the most part, you still leave the city or part of the city at a minimum in shambles. Everything's in ruins. Now, what I noticed, especially for modern Ultraman, uh, there have been like evacuation procedures so the people can get out of the buildings the moment the monsters arrive and before any fighting could begin, to minimize casualties. But for the most part, yeah, everything happens all of a sudden, and even if you have a if you have some sort of announcement that you can probably implement, the government would do that, for example. Yeah, if things happen so fast, I doubt that any civilian would be able to act as quickly as possible. So, you're gonna end up pretty much with a lot of people trapped in buildings that couldn't get out in time. Yeah, you're gonna have to be responsible for those as well, or at least it's gonna be on your conscience. So, there's that. Sorry if I ruined things for you. However, considering this, not all is lost. Here I am going to probably recommend a few shows that are kind of the exemption on these parts. Now, for kaiju, well, I'm sorry, I don't have any idea of which show or movie has a kaiju that could, mitigate damage. Uh, Again, kaijus are a very difficult thing to consider here, considering the damage that any giant monster can do, again, on a regular basis. If you're going to follow a weekly format, then yeah, it's difficult to rebuild the city every week. So it's probably not gonna happen. So for Ultraman, however, there is one show that comes to mind in terms of damage mitigation. And this one is Ultraman Nexus. Now, Ultraman Nexus can emit some sort of a special field that uh, basically sends himself and the enemy to another dimension. And if you are going to use that each and every time, then not only are you going to have an advantage because it somehow boosts uh, Ultraman Nexus's power, but also at the same time, because it is in a different dimension, all the damages that's going to happen would be kept inside that universe. So again, if you're going to choose an Ultraman, you should probably choose Ultraman Nexus in that regard. Now, for the most part, yeah, because Ultramen fight on Earth, you're probably going to suffer a lot of damage, and yeah, Ultraman Nexus has the ability to very much reduce collateral damage to zero. So yeah, he's probably the closest bet that I can give you guys. Now for Super Sentai series, I mentioned earlier, for the most part, Super Sentai heroes have to battle giant robots. However, this wasn't originally the case, because two Super Sentai shows don't have giant monsters. Those being Himitsu Sentai Go Ranger and Dengeki Sentai Jackie, or yeah, uh, so Dengeki Tai Jackie. So Jaka, yeah, Jaka Dengeki Tai. There we go, got it correct. So you would have to pick either Go Ranger or Jaka in order to at least reduce damage. They do fight in specialized vehicles, but that's the closest they get. They don't have giant robots, considering that their enemies don't grow large anyway. Now, they do fight in areas that are far from the city. Of course, for like production reasons. So yeah, for the real world explanation, you have to film in an area that's far from uh, people in order to actually avoid any civilian injuries. So if we would apply that to the in-universe logic, then I would say uh, Go Ranger or Jacka would be better in that regard. So again, because of the possible damage and you know threat to life in general, you probably shouldn't choose ones with giant monsters and robots that have to fight on a regular basis because of the damage. That's basically what I'm trying to say. So, for other franchises, now let's take a look at Kamen Rider, shall we? Now, for the Showa era, if we look at the Showa era and probably the early 90s Heisei Riders, which basically function like Showa era, you don't have to worry about a bigger scale of damage. Well, sure, enemies would come in troops, but they don't usually have weapons, or they don't have enemies that can cause damage on a large scale. And the Kamen Riders are basically able to handle them anyway without much problem. So, in that regard, you would probably choose. I would recommend any Showa Kamen Rider, the 90s Kamen Riders, probably with the exception of Kamen Rider J, because he can turn into a giant and his enemies can turn into giants as well, so you might want to avoid that. But for the modern Kamen Riders, well, uh, especially the recent ones, there have been instances of, let's say, Kamen Riders, or there have been enemies that are able to cause large scale destruction. Some of them can even summon giant robots or giant monsters. So you might want to avoid the later Heisei Kamen Riders, or probably even uh, Reiwa Kamen Riders from now on. If there are enemies that, again, are large in size and can cause a lot of destruction. So, yeah, you might want to avoid that. Now, other franchises that come to my mind, well, there's a short lived franchise created by Toho Company, the same producers of Godzilla and all those other giant monster movies. They created in the early 2000s the Star God series. So it's basically an attempt by Toho to rival Super Sentai, but they only had 3 shows. I enjoyed them in general, but yeah, because it probably didn't become popular enough that it didn't last for very long. So because they are a Sentai like show, and because they are made by Toho, so expect giant monsters, you probably should avoid that franchise as well. So, moving on to another short lived franchise, which is the Tomika Heroes. Now, uh, they only had 2 shows, but they kind of established a short lived universe. So, in this universe, you don't it's kind of complicated because you do find monsters that are quite large, not as large as monsters that grow in Super Sentai, or not as large as kaiju from the Toho franchises, but those monsters are basically embodiments of natural disasters. So you do have enemies that can create weapons or even monsters that are able to cause big scale attacks and destruction. So we probably would avoid that as well. And the next franchise that comes to my mind is the Garo franchise. Now, for this one, we're just going to focus on the live action because within the Garo franchise, you do have anime titles as well, but let's just focus on the live action. Now, what's interesting about the Garo franchise is that they do have large monsters, but they don't usually appear close to the city or any place where there are a lot of people. Now, the enemies in this franchise, called the Horrors, typically just come out at night, and their main goal is to hunt and eat humans. And in order to do that, you don't really need to destroy stuff. You don't actually have to um, you're not you could be powerful enough, but not so strong that you could destroy a whole building in one swing. No, probably there are stronger horrors that can do that, but in general they don't usually happen, or that kind of destruction doesn't happen. So for the giant monsters in Garo, one particular example that I remember is the horror named Messiah. She is dubbed the mother of all horrors. She is a giant, but the good thing is she lives inside the Makai realm. So she basically lives in a spirit world, which is, of course, separate from our real world. And the only threat is that, the only thing that's stopping her is probably her weak state, because apparently when she was fought by Koga Saejima, she was not at full power. She's basically trapped in the Makai realm, and she is looking for a way to come out. So if you're going to become a Makai Knight, that's probably what you're gonna do. Find a way to stop Messiah from ever setting foot on this earth. So you could probably encounter a big monster like a few stories high, but not necessarily big enough to the scale of, again, Super Sentai monsters or Toho's kaijus. So they're much smaller in comparison, but again, horrors don't usually set out to destroy buildings, but when they do, uh, what usually happens is that most of the people have already gone out, and if even if they do destroy buildings, it's only limited to like one or two at most. But again, not big enough to be considered a large threat because Makai Knights usually deal with them early on. So I could recommend being a Makai Knight. Now, speaking of which, if I am going to recommend the Garo franchise, if you're going to live in that, well, you probably would choose to become a Makai Knight. I bet most of you watching who are Garo fans would do so. But in order to do that, you must always choose to be born male. I know it's very sexist, but it's established in the Garo universe that only men can become Makai Knights. But don't discount the Makai priests and priestesses just yet. A Makai priest that has learned a very powerful spell that could probably even eliminate or at least stop a god level horror from becoming a threat would be much better than, let's say, a Hagane, which is a mass-produced Makai Knight and is considered to be of the lowest quality. So again, a Makai priest or priestess with a very powerful spell could actually be more useful than a generic Makai Knight. So you can also probably choose to be proficient in other types of weaponry, uh, like firearms. A great example of this would be Rian from the Yamio Terasu Mono universe. So she does have a pistol, and she uses it in combination with her brush. In the original universe, the Koga Saijima universe, so there are Makai priests equipped with mechanical pets called Goryu. So you do have them as well. So yeah, you can become a Makai priest if you choose to do so, and that's always an open option for women. Again, if you're a powerful Makai priestess, you'd probably much better off than becoming a low-ranked Makai Knight. That's what I'm saying. So yeah, speaking of powers, so I've just mentioned the uh, Garo franchise and everything that comes with it. Now, so we're going to go back to other series. Now, considering the power sets, okay, and for the kaijus, I have mentioned earlier that they can cause a lot of destruction. So, if you want to smash everything in sight, then yeah, become a kaiju by all means. So, if you want to pilot giant robots, well, Super Sentai is your thing. Now, you could also choose to become. You could also choose the Star God series because they also pilot giant robots, and even the Tomika Heroes because they also do have giant mechs as well. So yeah, you can choose any of those if you want giant robots. Now, for Kamen Rider, well, you do have the powerful suits, and you are able to take on a bunch of enemies by yourself usually. That's the difference between, like, for example, the Kamen Rider series and the Super Sentai series. Both of both of those franchises feature heroes that fight groups of enemies at one time, but a Kamen Rider would be considered more powerful in that regard because he or she can take down groups of enemies alone. Although working together with other riders would be very convenient and helpful, but a lot of riders can handle their own in battles. So it's your choice. Now for Ultraman, well, you do have the power of flight because you're giant. You are very strong and durable, and if you are able to fly like at the speed of light, then you can probably travel to different universes, or at least travel the known universe in a matter of seconds or minutes if you're not really that fast. But again, it's still a very impressive feat. So if you want those kinds of powers, then go for the Ultraman franchise. Now, for other consequences that you might want to avoid if you're going to choose any of those franchises, well, if you're going to choose Super Sentai, just don't go with, the poses. Avoid long transformations. Avoid roll calls. Like, if you're going to transform, choose a Sentai that can transform quickly and, you know, if possible, actually, you could transform before going on to the battlefield. In that regard, I highly recommend Jakka Dengekitai because they transform inside these capsules within their base, so when they go out, they are already suited up and ready for battle. Again, just avoid all those flashy poses. I know it's one of the things that makes Super Sentai what it is, but in reality, that's impractical. The enemy's not gonna wait for you. They probably shoot you down before you're finished, before you're even halfway. So, yeah. Now, for other series, well, again, the Star God series and the Tomika Hero series, they do share a lot with Super Sentai. So again, because of that, you might want to avoid long transformations and uh, impractical pre-fight poses. So there's that. So yeah. Uh, as for my personal choices, like I said earlier, I would probably choose Ultraman Nexus if I were to become an Ultraman because of his meta field. I believe that's the technique. So because I'm able to send myself and an enemy into another dimension, I can reduce collateral damage and probably bring it down to zero. So that really helps. And because Ultraman Nexus can transform into Ultraman Noah, which was established by Ultraman Zero's lore as the first Ultraman, then you have that honor as well. And not to mention, Noah is very, very powerful. So go for it. Now, I would also choose, well, for Super Sentai, again, because I recommend Jakka, Dengekitai, and Go Ranger, so I would probably go with either one as well. In terms of realism, so for the Garo franchise, again, well, I can choose to become any Makai Knight if I do say so, but I would have to work hard to avoid, the appearance of a large, of a large horror, and try to defeat it as soon as possible, so that it cannot grow any further or cause any damage on a large scale. So again, the Garo franchise uh, is highly recommended on that. So yeah. So those are some of my choices. So, anyways, at the end of the day, if you're going to choose a Tokusatsu world to live in, well, it's up to you. But let me know in the comments which Tokusatsu franchise would you like to live in, and probably tell me why. So, anyways, leave them in the comments. So thank you for watching. Please leave a like, comment, subscribe, and don't forget that notification bell so you get the latest from JE Fusion. This has been Philip, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!